Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be doing our July 2022 governor's predictions for this fall's midterm election. So we'll be taking a look at all of the competitive gubernatorial races around the country and ranking all of the non-safe ones. So basically, the safe states which are already filled out are the states that either party will win by 12 points or more. A couple of them I want to talk about briefly. The state of Illinois. This ranking used to be likely in previous projections, but since Darren Bailey has won the primary, I've moved it to safe Democrats since he's not really a viable candidate. He was the Trump pick, very popular among the Republican base, but I feel like he will do very poorly reaching out to moderate voters in the Chicago suburbs. So one of the reasons why I moved that ranking. Similar story in Maryland. Dan Cox, a delegate from Frederick, Maryland, has won the primary there. Also Trump's pick. Same story. Kelly Scholes, who was the more moderate Republican, lost mainly due to the fact that Trump had endorsed Dan Cox and basically berated Scholes as a rhino, and this was mostly just to get back at Governor Larry Hogan for his criticisms against Trump and whatnot. So I've moved this to safe as well, considering that Dan Cox is not a viable candidate. He's a very Trumpian candidate in a state that Biden won by 33 points. He is by no means a Larry Hogan or moderate Republican. So those are really the biggest changes from the last video. So anyway, let's get straight into it. But before we do, please consider subscribing down below if you're new and liking this video if you enjoy. So we're going to start off with the state of Oregon and make our way all the way east. So Oregon kind of has a three-way race going on at the moment. If we take a look at the Oregon polls, the Republican Christine Drazan is actually leading in the latest poll by just 1 point. And it's kind of a back and forth between the Democrat and the Republican here, mostly because Betsy Johnson seems to be taking a large chunk of the vote from both candidates. Now, typically, early polling does tend to overestimate independent and third-party candidates, but as it stands right now, Betsy Johnson is somewhat a viable third-party contender. Ultimately, I don't think she'll end up being the next governor of Oregon, but at this rate, she could certainly play spoiler for either the Democrat or the Republican, since she's much more of a moderate to conservative Democrat, very comparable to Joe Manchin in some ways in terms of Oregon state politics. She blocked a lot of progressive legislation from passing, despite Democrats having full control of the state's government. So she's taking away from Tina Kotek, but she also seems to be taking away from Drazan as well. I mean, Oregon is a state that Donald Trump got about 40% of the vote in. And given the fact that 2022 is expected to be a better year for Republicans, they shouldn't be down at just 32 or 30%. But again, these polls are early, and as more people learn who the candidates are, I think both Kotek and Drazan will start to do better overall. But I still think Betsy Johnson will be a large factor. So given the fact that Betsy Johnson does tend to lean more to the left, though, she could hurt Tina Kotek as it stands. But I still am going to put this race as tilt Democrat, just because I still think Kotek has a slight edge in this race. Now, again, this rating might change, but as of right now, I'm going to keep it with a slight edge for the Democrats. Moving on down to the state of Nevada. Nevada's governorship, like the Senate race, is expected to be very competitive. Joe Lombardo, I think, is a really good pick for the Republicans. He's somebody who actually is somewhat in favor of gun control, interestingly enough, as sheriff of Clark County. So he does actually support red flag laws, which a lot of the base doesn't support, but certainly moderate independent voters do. Sisolak is only up 2 points in the polls right now, and the latest polls have Joe Lombardo certainly within striking distance, and some of the earlier polls actually have him ahead. Now, the latest poll out of Emerson College only surveys registered voters, so I think it's underestimating Lombardo's support, but I think we're going to keep this rating the same as it was in the last video, as a lean Republican. I think Lombardo could probably win this by about 3 to 4 points. Maybe a bit closer, depending on how the polls are, but given the national environment and given the fact that Lombardo seems to be very competitive in the polling, I'm going to give him a slight edge in this case. Moving on down to the state of Arizona. Arizona is going to have a very contentious primary, I think, in about 2 weeks, between more moderate, not even 2 weeks, about a week from now, against the more establishment Karen Taylor Robeson, and of course the Trump firebrand candidate Kari Lake. And we'll talk about that primary in a separate video. I won't go into it right now. But ultimately, if we take a look at the general election polling, Taylor Robeson is down to Katie Hobbs by 5 in the latest poll. Kari Lake is down by even more, but I have a couple of problems with these polls. Target Smart is a Democratic-leaning poll. So is GQR research. So, those polls are a bit skewed to the left. There's a relatively smaller sample size in these polls. I think whoever the Republican nominee is, whether it's Kari Lake or Taylor Robeson, I think they're likely to win this race. Since it looks like Kari Lake is going to be the Republican nominee, I'm going to put this as lean for the Republicans. I think if Taylor Robeson was, I could see maybe a 7 or even 8 point margin of victory, potentially. She's much stronger in the suburbs, but I think Kari Lake, even though she's a much more conservative candidate, very Trumpian, Trump's obviously doing a lot of stumping for her, she's still going to be able to win in this off-year environment. So I'm going to give the edge to Kari Lake in that state. Moving on up to the state of Colorado, Jared Polis, the Democratic incumbent, is very popular. His approval rating, I think, is in the high 50s to low 60s, so he's a very popular governor. Also, you have his Republican opponent, the last Republican statewide official in Colorado, I think on the Board of Regents, Heidi Ganahl. And there's also a Constitution candidate, which historically in Colorado tends to hurt Republicans very greatly. So if we take a look at the polling now, Heidi Ganahl is polling abysmally. She's down by a tremendous amount. And, early polls, again, these are all from the same polling firm. It's a Democratic polling firm. But I think, as I've said in previous video, Jared Polis is going to win this by a likely margin. I expect him to win it probably anywhere from 6 to 8 points. I think the red wave environment will help Ganahl in rural areas, but it's not going to be enough to offset Polis's popularity in Democratic-leaning suburbs around Denver. So I think that race is going to stay for the Democrats pretty comfortably. I think the Senate race has a potential to be closer, and we'll talk about that in the Senate prediction video. Next up, we have the state of New Mexico. Michelle Lujan Grisham, the incumbent Democratic governor, is one of the most unpopular incumbents up for re-election in the country. I believe her approval rating is only in the mid-40s, which isn't really great considering she's running for re-election in a tough environment. And New Mexico historically, despite being a blue state on, in statewide races like attorney general, treasurer, all that, it does tend to vote for Republican governors, and it did in 2010 and 2014, and it very well could again in 2020. Currently, Michelle Lujan Grisham is up by about 3.5 percentage points, but her Republican opponent is considerably strong, and even in a Democratic-leaning poll, which only just surveys voters, she's only up by about 3 points. Mike Ronchetti, who is the Republican nominee, is a very strong nominee. He outran Trump by about 4 to 5 points in 2020. If we take a look at his performance, he got 45.6% of the vote here in New Mexico, where Trump only got about 43%. It's well known now since his last run, and I think he's going to have the momentum on his side. This is one of my more bolder predictions, but I actually think Ronchetti has a chance to pull sort of a Glenn Youngkin in the state of New Mexico. I think he's perfectly tailored for the state. I think Michelle Lujan Grisham has the detriment of having a Democrat from the same party in the presidency doing very poorly nationwide, and also Republican enthusiasm across the country. I think that'll push Ronchetti over the top in New Mexico. Moving on up to the state of Kansas, Laura Kelly, the incumbent Democratic governor, currently is in a lot of trouble. She's running in a deeply red state for re-election. She only won by about 5 points, and her win can really be attributed to just two factors: the blue wave environment, but mainly the fact that her Republican opponent was uniquely bad for the state of Kansas. He was very bad optically, a little bit too conservative for the state overall, and Kelly had the advantage of painting him as a fringe far-right candidate. And ultimately, she ended up winning by about 5 points back in 2018. But if we take a look now at 2020, she's going to be in a lot more trouble. Derek Schmidt was actually the Republican who got elected by the widest margin in Kansas back in the 2018 elections, and he's currently running against her. He's likely to be the nominee. It's almost assured. I don't really think he has any viable challengers for the nomination. But ultimately, I think Kansas will flip back to the Republican Party. I've consistently had Kansas as likely Republican, and I think Derek Schmidt will likely win this race by about 8 to 10 points. Laura Kelly doesn't have the benefit of having the abortion referendum on the same day as the general election. I think that could help her a tad bit. But again, most voters don't vote on the issue of abortion. Now, we'll actually talk about the Kansas abortion referendum in a video coming up soon, because I do want to talk about that, because I think the results and what I think will happen in that referendum might surprise some people watching. So stay tuned for that. That'll definitely come out. But ultimately, I think this is going to be a likely flip for the Republicans. Moving on down to the state of Texas. Texas was once a safe Republican state on the presidential level. That is no longer the case. Some will argue that Texas is trending more Republican, but the Dallas-Fort Worth area, San Antonio, Austin, are all still trending dramatically so to the left. So if we take a look at the general election polling here in Texas, Greg Abbott is up in the aggregate by about anywhere from 6 to nearly 8 points, depending on which aggregate you look at. And ultimately, there's some polls that have it relatively close. You have a YouGov poll that has Abbott only up by 5. But ultimately, I think the Republican momentum will help Abbott. The question is, how much does Abbott win by? And what does it really say about Texas overall trending toward the Democratic Party? You know, if we go back to 2014, quite a long time ago, politically speaking, but really only 8 years ago, Greg Abbott won the governor's election by about 21 percentage points against Wendy Davis, who a lot of liberal commentators and media pundits thought was actually viable to flip the state. Obviously, looking at it politically speaking, that was quite delusional, given the fact that 2014 was expected to be a terrible year for Democrats. And also, at that point, Texas was a safe state for Romney back in 2012. But taking a look ahead at Texas now, it's really hard to pinpoint where this race will end up going. The polls in Texas did underestimate Trump by a couple of points. I think they're likely to underestimate Republicans even by a tad bit more this time around, given the midterm environment. Ultimately, I think Abbott will increase his poll numbers as we get closer to election. I still think Texas will be safe. I think it'll be probably about 12.5 points, maybe 13. But, you know, if Abbott overperforms that, I think that is a good sign for Republicans in the state. But if Abbott does, you know, worse than that or only wins by 10 or something like that, it does show you that the trends in Texas are real and they're quite dramatic for Republicans. So, you know, Democrats have room for excitement if that's the case, and obviously Republicans have a lot of room to worry. Moving on up to Minnesota, we talked about Minnesota in a previous video and what Republicans' chances in the state were, and ultimately my verdict was the Democrats still have the upper hand in this race. Currently, Tim Walz is ahead by about 3.5 points, which you'll note is the same margin that Michelle Lujan Grisham is ahead in New Mexico. But one of the reasons why I think Minnesota is dramatically different from a state like New Mexico is it hasn't routinely elected Republicans in these red off years. In fact, if we go back to 2014, the last red wave midterm, they re-elected Governor Mark Dayton by about 6 points, despite the national environment being about R+6. So Minnesota was about D+6 in an R+6 environment. Now, obviously, governor's races, these other races, aren't exactly the same as federal ones, are always tied into the federal environment, but I think it is still a bad sign for the Republicans overall that despite these favorable years, they were unable to flip a state like Minnesota, which Republicans have been trying to flip for decades, quite honestly. So I still think Tim Walz at the end of the day will probably win by about 3 or 4 points. I think it'll be a closer race, obviously, than his 2018 practical landslide where he won by about 11 points. But ultimately, I don't see Republicans flipping this state in 2022. I don't think it's going to be that much of a red wave, at least in the state of Minnesota. Moving east to Wisconsin, this will be an interesting race too. The Wisconsin primary is coming up between former Republican Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Kleefisch and Tim Michels, who is the Trump-endorsed candidate. Interestingly enough, though, I don't really know the big difference between Kleefisch and Michels. They both seem like very conservative Republicans. Kleefisch just has more political experience, but and also a lot of endorsements. But ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of which one of these Republicans end up advancing to the general election, I think they are slightly favored to win this race. Now, that is quite shocking, I guess you could say, when you look at the pollings where Tony Evers is up by 4 points, is up by 7 points. But this is a state where Tony Evers in 2018 only won by about a point, 1.3%, I think it was. He won by a very narrow margin, 1.1 rather, I was wrong. So this was a state that during a blue wave year, despite all the momentum that Democrats had, he was only able to unseat Scott Walker by 1.1%. And I think ultimately going into 2022 with very little legislative accomplishments, he's been obviously blocked by the Republican legislature there. I don't think voters are going to see him as a very effective governor. And that's why for a long time, I've been putting Wisconsin as a flip for the Republican Party. I think it's going to be a lean flip. I think it's going to be close. Wisconsin tends to be close, but I think it'll probably be somewhere in the ballpark of about 2 to 3 percentage points. Moving on over to Michigan. Now, Michigan is a state that Donald Trump won back in 2016. He lost by less than 3 points in 2020. Given the midterm environment, Michigan really should be a state that Republicans are doing well in. But Gretchen Whitmer, to her credit, is holding her own. And, I'm not just looking at polling for that as well. The Republican primary, quite frankly, in Michigan has been a total disaster. A bunch of Republicans were disqualified from the ballot. One of them was actually arrested and charged with a crime. So really not a good showing for the Republicans overall. And, Gretchen Whitmer currently is polling ahead by 11, 10 points. I don't buy that at all. Michigan polling tends to be quite bad. I think it's going to be a lot closer than that. But I could see Gretchen Whitmer at the end of the day winning by about 1.5 to 2 points. So I'm going to put it in the tilt Democratic category still, as I did in my last video. Obviously, this rating could change, but as I see it right now, I think Gretchen Whitmer still has the advantage, especially since Michigan is a more liberal state than Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. Tudor Dixon, who is the likely Republican nominee at this point, she's the one who has the momentum. On the issue of abortion, says she supports no exceptions, and I think, maybe in a state like Michigan, that would hurt the Republican nominee, especially since Gretchen Whitmer has made a big part of her campaign abortion, although there's a lot of issues on the table as well. So that's just something to note, but I still think Gretchen Whitmer is in a strong position, mainly because I don't really see a strong field of Republicans at this moment. The party is very divided in Michigan, and ultimately she does have a lot of money in fundraising to keep this seat blue. Moving on up to the state of Maine, we have Janet Mills, the incumbent Democratic governor, against former Republican Governor Paul LePage. Now, this is a really interesting race because it really hasn't gotten a lot of attention. Currently, Mills is up by about 3.5 percentage points. Paul LePage is polling at about 40.5%. The latest poll, which is a combination of Fabrizio Ward and Impact Research, has Janet Mills up by 5. I previously had this race as tilt Republican. I might change that to tilt Democrat. Just for now, I think Janet Mills does still have a slight edge, but it's very possible for somebody like Paul LePage to pull an upset, especially since he was a two-term Republican governor. Now, again, that's a change from my rating back a month ago when I had this race as tilt Republican, but I think Janet Mills still does have the advantage, although Paul LePage, I've heard, is running a pretty decent campaign. He's been doing a number of campaign stops around the state, so perhaps I'll change that rating next month. But as of right now, I still give the Democrats a slight edge in Maine. Moving on down to Rhode Island, I'm going to put this as likely Democrat just because the incumbent governor, Dan McKay, is very unpopular. He's also, in fact, headed into a pretty interesting primary, which we could take a look at some of the polls here. But he's in a position where he could actually lose a primary for governor, and that's kind of a mess. I don't really know who the Republicans are running. I don't know if they have any strong candidates, if there's any moderate New England Republicans actually running, because they certainly could flip the governorship in Rhode Island. Obviously somebody is a Trump Republican is going to get crushed in a state like Rhode Island, so it really depends on the nominee, but I'll keep it as likely for now, just because third-party candidates tend to swallow up a lot of votes in these statewide races. We can go back to 2014 as a perfect example. Gina Raimondo only won by about 4 points back in 2014, and even in 2018, when she technically won by a safe margin, she still only got 52.8% of the vote. Alan Fung got 37.3%. The rest went to third-party candidates. So Rhode Island, for whatever reason, tends to like third-party candidates, gives them about 7 or 8% of the vote. So ultimately, that's the reason why I keep that as likely. Finally, we move on to the state of Connecticut. This will be our last state here in the New England region. Currently, Ned Lamont is up by about 10 points in the state. Stefanowski, the Republican, was the nominee back in 2018, and he made this race really, really close. In fact, he only lost by 3.2 percentage points. One of the reasons he did so well was because of the unpopularity of the outgoing Democratic governor, Dan Malloy, who was I think his approval rating was in the mid-20s, if I'm not mistaken. Super, super unpopular. Ned Lamont probably just won this race based off of the blue wave year. He was able to get enough Democrats to come out and vote for him. I think if this was a year where Republicans were favored, I think Bob Stefanowski could have won. But ultimately, Connecticut is still a very Democratic state. And while this is a much redder year than 2018, I'm still going to put this as lean Democrat as of right now, since Stefanowski is polling. He's down by 10. Obviously, if things change, perhaps I'll move the rating. Ned Lamont is much more popular than Dan Malloy is. His popularity is, in fact, in the low 60s, high 50s. So he's a much more popular governor. And, Connecticut is not really a state that's known to elect Republicans in these off-year races. It tends to have very close governor's races, but ultimately the Democrats win out. We saw that in 2010. We saw it in 2014, and perhaps it'll happen in 2022 as well. Moving on over to Pennsylvania, we're actually going to make a separate video on this because recently the Republican Governors Association decided essentially not to give the Republican nominee, Doug Mastriano, any money, at least for the time being, to help him in his gubernatorial bid. So looking at Pennsylvania, this could be an interesting race because even though Mastriano really doesn't have a lot of party support, he's polling considerably well. He's within the margin of error in every single poll. This margin of error is 4.4. He's down by 4, etc. So in all of these polls, he's within the margin of error, despite him being painted as a radical. And I really think this comes down to polarization. Republican voters, by and large, 95% of them are going to vote for the Republican no matter what, whether that's Mastriano or whether that was Barletta or somebody else. A lot of people have declined to endorse him. Mitt Romney, obviously Pat Toomey, the incumbent senator, Tom Marino, who I think was associated with the Barletta campaign, decided not to endorse him. So you actually even had a former Republican representative endorse Shapiro. So I actually think that Mastriano will surprise a lot of people in November and could pull a Trump in the state, because while Mastriano was campaigning pretty far right in the primary, he's moved a lot more to the center, at least in campaign rhetoric, and I think that will help him. One thing that does hurt him, though, is Josh Shapiro's war chest. But I think, and this is my prediction, whatever party wins the Senate race is likely to win the governorship, too, based on partisanship. While Pennsylvania does tend to split ticket, I don't think you're going to see a dramatic enough of split ticketing in 2022 to where you have the Democrats winning one race and the Republicans winning another. So I do think that Mastriano will narrowly win this race for Pennsylvania governor as of right now. I think he'll win probably by about 1.5 points. Could even be closer, but I think he will eke it out just because of the midterm environment and because the RNC will be putting a lot of money into the Senate race. Hopefully for his case, they'll be putting it into the governor's race as well, but I still think he's going to win. While Shapiro does have a large fundraising advantage, I think his campaign is too focused on Donald Trump and the perceived badness of Donald Trump to try and scare the Democrats into coming out. I don't really think that's a good campaign strategy. It didn't work for Terry McAuliffe, and that was in a much bluer state. Obviously, Mastriano is further right than Glenn Youngkin, but still, I don't really think it's a good campaign strategy overall or a good motivator at the end of the day for swing voters. People want to know what you want to do for the state, not necessarily what to be afraid of. But ultimately, again, Shapiro does have a decent shot at this race. He is a strong-ish candidate. He outran Biden back in 2020, but I don't think he's running exactly the best campaign. So ultimately, that's why I put this race as tilt Republican. And that could very well change. We only have 3 polls right now, but early polling does tend to favor Democrats. So the fact that Mastriano is in the margin of error this early is one of the main reasons why I have this rating. Moving on down to the state of Georgia, it looks like Brian Kemp is on track to win re-election pretty easily. I think he's likely to win by about 5 or 6 points. Currently, all of the polling has him up. There's not a single poll that has Stacey Abrams above Brian Kemp. Even among registered voters, they tie, and in some registered voter polls, Brian Kemp is ahead. Overall, at the end of the day, I see Brian Kemp winning this race by about 5 points. I think the polling is going to be correct in this race. I think Brian Kemp is likely to win by about 5 points. The polling was basically spot on in the 2020 election, and it was pretty close in the runoff as well. Finally, we go down to the state of Florida. Ron DeSantis will easily win re-election, probably by about 8 to 10 points against Charlie Crist. If Nikki Fried was the nominee, I think he would do even better just because I think she's running a more left-wing campaign. Although, interestingly enough, Nikki Fried is actually tied in the latest poll, although I don't really buy that considering the primary overall, Charlie Crist, who was recently, he was a Republican back in 2006, switched parties. He's been ahead throughout the entire primary, so he's likely to be the Democratic nominee, and I think he's likely to lose. You do have these outlier polls that have Charlie Crist leading, but all of them are basically the same political matrix, have all had Crist leading by a lot. I don't know what kind of methodology they're doing to get such a lopsided margin. It is kind of interesting how off base it is. But ultimately, it looks like Ron DeSantis is on track for an easy re-election. And that is it for today's video. That is the governor predictions for the month of July. We'll be doing a Senate prediction for the month of July later on before the end of the month, so stay tuned for that. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoyed. And as always, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.